The collapse of a nation rarely begins with gunfire. It usually starts much more quietly, in an air-conditioned room, with polite handshakes and the soft rustle of paperwork. Take Athens in 2010, or Mexico City in 1995. The script is always the same. Men in dark suits arrive, carrying briefcases filled with non-negotiable numbers. The media calls them a rescue squad. The government calls them strategic partners. But if you look closely at the contracts they bring, dense documents that will dictate the price of medicine, the wages of nurses, and the future of millions, you see a different reality. They didn't come to save a country. They came to restructure it. And in the world of sovereign debt, restructuring is often just a polite word for a transfer of ownership. In the study of power, there is an unwritten law that every historian knows but few economists admit. A bureaucracy never dies when its mission ends. It simply finds a new reason to exist. Go back to August 15, 1971, the day the gold window closed. The Bretton Woods system, the fixed exchange rate architecture the IMF was built to guard, collapsed overnight. Logically, the International Monetary Fund should have packed its bags. Its jurisdiction was gone. Its original mandate was obsolete. The referee had no game left to officiate. But institutions with that much capital and political connection do not just close up shop. Instead, they did something brilliant. They pivoted. They rewrote their own job description. They went from being the referee of currency wars to becoming the doctor for sick economies. It seems like a subtle shift in language, but it was a massive shift in leverage. A referee can only blow a whistle. But a doctor? A doctor holds a scalpel. A doctor has authority over the body. A doctor dictates what you eat, how you live, and what parts of you need to be cut off to save the whole. And the patients? They were the developing nations of the global south. Newly independent, desperate for cash, and lacking the leverage to say no. This was the moment the relationship changed. It was no longer about maintaining global stability. It became about crisis management. And this brings us to a cynical yet necessary realization about the business of crisis. In private healthcare, there is a dark incentive that we all whisper about but rarely confront. You don't necessarily need to cure the patient to stay in business. You just need to ensure the patient stabilizes but remains dependent on your medicine. If the IMF had truly succeeded in its new mission, the list of countries needing emergency loans should have shrunk over the last 40 years. Instead, the list has grown. The patients keep coming back. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was simply the survival instinct of a massive organization. The fund needed a purpose. The world provided the crises. And to solve them, they didn't create a custom treatment plan for every unique culture or economy. No, they developed a single, rigid formula. One prescription to treat every illness, from the mountains of Peru to the markets of Indonesia. In the lexicon of global finance, the most dangerous things are often given the most boring names. Take the phrase structural adjustment program. It sounds technical, harmless, like a renovation project to fix a leaking roof. But if you strip away the bureaucratic jargon and read the fine print, you realize it is not a renovation. It is a demolition. Every one of these agreements, whether signed in the 1980s or today, is built on the same four pillars. I call them the fourizations. They are the standard operating procedure for transforming a sovereign nation into a compliant market. First, there is stabilization. On paper, this means balancing the books. In reality, it is a polite word for austerity. It demands that a government stop spending money. It means cutting subsidies for food, slashing public sector wages, and shrinking the safety net. The logic is cold and mathematical. To pay back the bankers, the citizens must consume less. Second is liberalization. This is the opening of the gates. The program requires the country to remove tariffs and barriers to trade. Foreign capital is invited to flood in. If local industries, small factories, family farms cannot compete with multinational giants, they are simply allowed to die. The market, we are told, will sort it out. Third is deregulation. The state is told to step back. Labor protections, environmental rules, and price controls are viewed as distortions. The goal is to make the country business-friendly, even if that means making it worker-hostile. And finally, the most critical and irreversible pillar, privatization. This is the liquidation sale. To raise cash quickly, the state is required to sell off its assets. We aren't just talking about empty land, we are talking about the crown jewels. The electrical grid, the water supply, the telecommunications network, the oil refineries. These assets are often sold at fire sale prices to foreign investors or local oligarchs. Once they are gone forever. The government loses its long-term revenue streams in exchange for a short-term cash injection. Economists call this improving allocative efficiency. A normal person would call it selling the furniture to pay the rent. To pay the rent. But here is the question that should bother you. Why would any sovereign leader agree to this? Why would a president sign a document that dismantles their own power and sells off their nation's future? They don't do it because they want to. They do it because they have no choice. The architects of these deals know that you cannot force a country to swallow this medicine unless you control the dosage. And that is why they don't give you the money all at once. There is a specific word in the contract that turns a loan into a leash. That word is tranches. In a normal world, when you get a loan, you get the money. In the IMF's world, you get a schedule. The funds are never released all at once. They are drip-fed, chemically measured, drop by drop. and to get the next drop, the patient has to prove they are following the doctor's orders. This is the mechanism of conditionality. It transforms a financial agreement into a behavior modification program. The control mechanism is hidden in boring technical appendices called quantitative performance criteria. These aren't suggestions, they are tripwires. They set hard numbers, a floor on net international reserves and a ceiling on net domestic credit. It sounds academic, but here is what it means in practice. If a government wants to print money to pay for emergency food imports, denied, it violates the credit ceiling. If they want to use foreign reserves to defend their crashing currency, denied, it breaks the reserve floor. If you miss a target, the waiver process begins. You have to beg for forgiveness. And if you don't get it, the next tranche of money is cut off. The drip feed stops. The economy goes into cardiac arrest. This is the longest and most critical phase. Monitoring. It lasts anywhere from 1 to 3 years. For those 3 years, your country technically still has a president. It still has a parliament. But the people who actually decide if the budget gets approved are a team of visiting economists staying at the best hotel in the capital. They check the books. They demand prior actions, reforms you must do before they even discuss the next payment. This explains why only a fraction of IMF programs ever receive the full amount of money originally promised. Most countries fail the test, or they break under the pressure. They call this a voluntary arrangement. It is voluntary in the same way a drowning man voluntarily gives up his watch for a life vest. It is not support, it is financial occupation, and this is where the disconnect happens. In Washington, success is when the cells on the Excel spreadsheet turn green, but when the numbers on the screen turn green, the streets in the real world often turn red. In the dry halls of economic theory, deaths are rarely called deaths. They are filed away under a cleaner, more professional term, negative externalities. But when you strip away the charts and the structural adjustment jargon, what you're looking at is a body count. Take Greece. Starting in 2010, the Troika, led by the IMF, arrived with a strict requirement. Public health spending was to be capped at 6% of GDP on a spreadsheet that looks like fiscal discipline. In the real world, it looks like a hospital without basic supplies. The mechanism of harm is both direct and surgical. To meet the IMF's payroll ceilings, hospitals were forced to freeze hiring and fire staff. In Athens, the cutting of needle exchange budgets and prevention programs led to a sudden, violent outbreak of HIV. Then comes the indirect blow. The program demanded currency devaluation to make the nation more competitive. But when your currency loses value, the price of everything imported skyrockets. Essential medicines, things like insulin or specialized equipment, suddenly cost more than a family can earn in a month. The data is consistent across decades of these programs. We see a direct correlation between these structural shifts and a rise in maternal and infant mortality rates. We see a surge in untreated depression and suicides as the social safety net is shredded to pay the interest on the debt. The fourizations reshape the very conditions in which humans are born, grow, and die. By the time the economists leave, the national debt might look sustainable. But the human capital is hollowed out. It is a profound irony of modern finance. The surgery is always declared a success. The financial system is saved. The banks are made whole. It is just the patient who didn't survive. If the price is this high, if the cost is paid in the health of mothers and the lives of the poor, it forces a question that the spreadsheets try to hide. If the nation is being bled dry to satisfy a debt, who is actually being rescued? If you want to understand the true nature of a rescue, you have to stop listening to the speeches and start following the money. We are told the IMF saves poor countries, but history suggests a much more cynical reality. The fund doesn't exist to save the nation. It exists to save the nation's creditors. This is the bailout paradox. It is built on a foundation of what economists call moral hazard. Imagine a global bank. They make a high-interest, high-risk loan to a developing nation, knowing the risks are extreme. In a true free market, if that nation defaults, the bank should lose its money. That is the price of a bad bet. But that's not what happens. When the crisis hits, the IMF steps in with a multi-billion-dollar package. The money enters through the front door of the country's central bank, but it doesn't stay there to build roads or fund schools. It is immediately wired out the back door to pay the interest and principal owed to international commercial banks in New York, London, or Frankfurt. The risk is magically transferred. It moves from the private balance sheets of billionaire investors and onto the backs of local taxpayers who must now pay back the IMF through decades of austerity. It is a world of selective ideologies. We have cold, hard capitalism for the poor, where you are told to suffer the consequences of market forces. And we have a soft, subsidized socialism for the financial elite, where the public always picks up the tab for a private failure. The IMF effectively acts as a global debt collector for the world's most powerful banks. They ensure that no matter how reckless the lending was, the big players never have to face the music. This explains the dependency we see. Nations aren't being helped to stand on their own feet. They are being kept on a life support system of debt just long enough to ensure every cent of interest is squeezed out for the creditors. Of course, the officials in Washington would find this characterization offensive. They have a different vocabulary for it. They speak of financial guarantees and pragmatic flexibility. They will point to the cases where the patient supposedly walked out of the hospital, fully recovered, They will tell you the story of Mexico in 1995, their greatest success story. In the world of international diplomacy, Mexico in 1995 is often presented as a miracle, the gold standard of how a financial doctor saves a patient from the brink of death. It's a seductive story. When the tequila crisis hit and Mexico ran out of dollars, the IMF stepped in with a massive, unprecedented package. But to understand the true cost of this miracle, you have to look past the press releases. You have to look at what they call flexibility. The fund admits that their initial assumptions were far too optimistic. As the crisis deepened, Mexico violated almost every major target they had agreed to, from foreign reserves to domestic credit. In a normal contract, that would be the end. But the IMF chose to grant waivers. They argue this was pragmatic flexibility, a sign that they are not the rigid, dogmatic machine their critics claim. They say it worked because by 1996, Mexico was back in the international capital markets. But for whom was it a success? If your only metric of success is the ability of a government to resume paying its debts to foreign bondholders, then yes, it was a triumph. But if you look at the ground level, the success looks different. To satisfy the IMF's demands for fiscal discipline, interest rates were spiked to nearly 80% almost overnight. The middle-class people who had worked for decades to buy a home or start a business was wiped out in a single season. Small enterprises that couldn't compete with the sudden liberalization of the market didn't just stumble, they vanished. This is the illusion. Macroeconomic stabilization is not the same thing as human prosperity. The IMF's flexibility wasn't about saving the Mexican worker. It was about ensuring that the sudden collapse of a major emerging market didn't trigger a systemic heart attack for the global financial order. When the primary objective is to make the creditors whole, austerity is always the right answer, not because it builds a better future, but because it squeezes the necessary cash out of the present. Mexico recovered, but it emerged as a different country. A country more dependent, more divided, and more integrated into a system it could no longer control. And this leads us to the final, most uncomfortable truth about the doctor's prescription. If the medicine is so effective, why does the patient so rarely leave the hospital for good? If a medical treatment is truly effective, the patient eventually leaves the hospital and never returns. But in the world of the International Monetary Fund, we see a very different pattern. Many nations don't just visit once, they stay for decades. This is the revolving door of sovereign debt. A study of IMF lending shows that once a country enters a structural adjustment program, the odds of them needing another one in the future don't decrease, they skyrocket. The reason is embedded in the four Zizations we discussed earlier. By forcing a country to prioritize exports and debt repayment over internal development, the program effectively hollows out the domestic economy. The nation becomes more vulnerable to global market shocks, not less. They trade their long-term economic sovereignty for short-term liquidity. They exit one crisis only to find themselves perfectly positioned for the next one. The fund has tried to fix its image. In recent years, they've rebranded. They've changed the names of their programs from structural adjustment to poverty reduction and growth facilities. But if you look at the mechanics, the core agenda remains unchanged. It is the same free market orthodoxy, the same austerity, and the same transfer of risk. New labels on old bottles, but the contents still produce the same intoxication of debt. You see, the IMF doesn't actually sell a cure for poverty. They sell a lifetime membership to the Global Debtors Club. They provide enough air to keep the patient breathing, but never enough to let them walk away from the oxygen tank. It is a system designed not for the liberation of nations, but for the maintenance of a specific financial order. This brings us back to where we started, to the air-conditioned rooms and the polite handshakes. After decades of stabilization, the question is no longer about whether the system works. The question is, who was it designed to work for? Because the ultimate power in the modern world is not the ability to win a war. It is the ability to make a nation sign a contract that they can never fulfill. We often think of independence as a flag waving atop a parliament building. But the story of the International Monetary Fund reminds us of a different definition of power. Real power isn't about who sits in the president's chair. It's about who holds the keys to the vault. This system doesn't operate through conspiracies in the shadows. It operates in the light, documented in transparent, 100-page reports that almost no one bothers to read. It wasn't designed to be cruel, it was designed to be efficient. But that efficiency demands a sacrifice, the absolute compliance of capital, regardless of the human cost. Perhaps in the modern financial era, national sovereignty is a luxury item that only a few nations can truly afford. For the rest, we are merely living in rented houses, hoping the landlord doesn't decide to sell the property tomorrow. If you want to understand more about the invisible mechanisms running this world, leave the number 1 in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Financial Money History. The next story is still being written.